What's going on? Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon. Good afternoon. What a day. I gotta say, I think today kind of went exactly how I kind of mentioned it in terms of what a seesaw type of events that ended up happening today, right? I kind of outlined the fact that as you see on the screen with SPY and this wedge closing in on us, that we would see a lot more of a whipsaw type of price action as the range that we're trading is likely basically closing in as the wedge is closing in and getting filled up. So we had a nice little rally this morning. I will say that that was a beautiful push that we had right into FOMC minutes. The data that ended up coming out kind of presented itself as a nice little buy the dip type of opportunity that we got earlier on this morning. So that was beautiful, but a nice little trend at least that helped kind of help the morning hours. But then once we ended up getting FOMC, we saw the breakdown, we saw the attempted recovery, and then we saw basically the follow through right back to the downside. So I will say right now, it does feel like sentiment though is still neutral to bullish right now. Is what pretty much took away from today. I don't see anything that pretty much tells us that we shouldn't necessarily fall off a cliff, and therefore that's why you see that the market was able to kind of snap back despite the FOMC minutes, right? The other thing that was pretty much astonishing this morning that kind of stood out to me was the downgrade off of Microsoft. Apparently, UBS actually came out earlier this morning, and they were actually warning about the cloud growth of Microsoft. Do I believe that it ended up warning? No, Microsoft being down. I believe it was around 3.5, 4% earlier on pre-market. No, I did not. I thought that was a little bit exaggerated, but that basically is part of the rotation in which it paved the way for the day that Tesla ended up having. At one point, it was up about $6.50 or so. And then we also had Apple that also had a pretty decent day as well. So that was basically the rotation that I got off of Microsoft, despite that downgrade, which I think was basically exaggerated in terms of that price action. But it is what it is. But what you pretty much wanted to distinguish earlier on was one, you had Tesla and Apple green, and two, you also had the semis that were pretty much looking green. And when I say semis, I know that AMD was rather flat, more so or less, but you did have Nvidia that was able to pretty much withstand and hold its gains for most of the day. All right. So that was pretty much what I took away from the get-go. The other name that I think I've been preaching for quite some time, I know it's not on anyone's favorite list, but Boeing had itself a monster day. I think I've been touching bases on Boeing for the past few days. So that's a name that I think we still actually have more upside. I'll see if I glance at the chart real quick. If I'm not mistaken, off top memory, I believe I have it going up to about 208 or so. But that's been a phenomenal name to pretty much trade. It's been holding up even when we've had red days. Boeing has been one of those names that has actually been able to withstand all the volatility that we've had. So that's something to pretty much keep an eye on. Meta, that was one that was on the newsletter from Avery. So if you caught the playoff of the newsletter, you knew exactly how to go about playing that one. And then Netflix. And I'm pretty sure, Lobo, good afternoon to you, my friend. I'm sure you probably caught something out of Netflix, but that was a monstrous move out of Netflix as well. We'll see if I take a peep at that chart real quick, but because I did not take a look at that at all. All right. Prachi, good afternoon, by the way. Please check Baba. Want a short belly, but no position yet. I will definitely take a look at it. Real quick before I actually move on from SPY, because like I was mentioning, the wedge is closing in. The range that we're trading is closing in. Did I was hoping for before we had the FOMC minutes. I was like, let's see if we actually get a break off of FOMC minutes. Is that the actual catalyst that we need to really get a breakout of this wedge? And that was not the case. So once I started to see us approach that resistance towards just before FOMC, and I was like, all right, we just started to fade it off of the news. I was like, okay, there's no way that we're breaking out of that wedge today. Even if we end up snapping back off of that little dip where we had immediately from FOMC, I'm like, there's no way they're gonna end up breaking this out because it would have been a convincing breakout of this wedge. So we'll see what catalyst ends up being, the that major factor for us to break out. I am anticipating that whatever given point, whether it be tomorrow, by the end of the week, it become beginning of next week for crying out loud, that we will end up breaking north of this wedge, and we will be looking at towards this gap fill up towards 388.94 for the immediate short term. All right. So other than that, though, the other thing I kind of wanted to outline was that I did stand out to pretty much two key levels here. To the upside, 384, and to the downside is 381. That's the range that I'm looking to play pretty much the extremes outside of that tomorrow. If we can pretty much get a move over 384, either you're going to look to play the rejection off a resistance of the wedge and look for the breakdown right back below 384. If you're looking for the downside, maybe we end up opening up really low. We open up right around 381. Then look for your other extreme, right? Look to see if support's going to hold around the 380 mark, 379 half, and then look to see if you can pretty much play a do it by the dip type of opportunity and play back above 381. So that's pretty much just the scenario. Those two key levels, looking to play around that in terms of the extremes of the resistance and support until we get the directional break. All right. Let's actually take a look real quick. I'm gonna look at Baba and then I'll see what other names I rotated to. All right. Wow, this thing is actually vertical. I did not look at Baba either. Wow, that thing is actually ridiculously vertical. I thought I actually heard that there was about 70% of people in China that actually had COVID. I did not anticipate that Baba would actually still surge despite that. But to your point, loved one, I think you actually mentioned something about that yesterday in terms of Disney, right? Even bad news is actually good news. This is one of those scenarios. All right. What I will say though is that you do have some nice little resistance sitting up here at 107. So I would particularly kind of stay clear of this Pachi until we end up getting up to 107. When you get to 107 Pachi, then look to see if you get the rejection at the 107, and then look to play off the rejection of that 107 in terms of shorting it. Otherwise, the flip side of that scenario will be is if you end up breaking over this 107 mark, then you're likely going to have a lot of eyes towards this gap fill that's sitting up above 109.33. All right, that's how I would pretty much eyeball this. I mean, that 107 is basically going to be the very key mark that you want to keep an eye on and look to play above it or in the rejection of it. All right, let's see what else there is. Netflix. Let's see if I can take a peep at Netflix. Let's see what's going on with Netflix. I gotta say, yeah, that was a monstrous move on Netflix. The one thing that actually stood out to me before, and that's basically when we had the nice little breakdown, we had a little bit of a rising wedge type of action, as you see I'm outlining right now. That was a beautiful little rising wedge action that we had. We ended up breaking down below it, but that was a hell of a reclaim that we had. So support that I'm actually particularly looking at right now is that we can end up retracing back down towards 294, and this would actually still be relatively a healthy setup for continuation to the upside. All right, so 294 is my bottom line for this to pretty much hold this overall trend that we're sitting in right now. Otherwise, if you're looking to play this tomorrow, I believe you more so look for to play beyond the gap fill here that I'm looking at on the daily, and that's on the break of 315. If you can get over 315, then you trade this up to 321 is what I would be looking for, and then 324. All right. But that's pretty much what I would ideally say. I wouldn't necessarily want to try and, if we kind of open flat more or less, I wouldn't necessarily try to end up playing this little gap fill type of zone here, because if we end up trying to play the gap fill and you get the rejection at 315, there's not much meat on the bone there, and you're likely going to end up getting trapped on any kind of calls that you're going to be in for Netflix. All right. So for me personally, I would prefer that it ends up breaking over 315. I played up to 321 and then 324. And if you end up getting any kind of retracement, you get a nice little drop. Maybe we end up seeing a bloody day tomorrow for whatever reason. Watch to see this end up retracing down towards 294, and that would be the support that you want to see ends up holding. All right, but yeah, that was a monstrous move. But then again, like I kind of kicked off YouTube saying, Microsoft kind of paved the way for a lot of different names to show a lot of strength here today. Tesla that wasn't showing relative strength, that was pretty much taking over for that weakness that was glaring from Microsoft earlier on. All right. So that's a name that you can keep an eye on. I know there's some eyes also on Apple. Apple's another one that's pretty much been on a lot of people's radar. We had a nice gap fill off of the daily here. And so we're looking to see if there's going to be a bounce, particularly here. I would say if you can get a move over 128 half, then we can see this trade up to 133. But if we don't end up getting that break over that 128 mark, then I would say that you're likely going to get a rejection, and you look to play puts off of the rejection if you don't get the move above. All right. Lobo, that's exactly the smart move. I mean, you got runners, in which case you've already secured profits. So I definitely like that idea. That 315 mark right into that gap fill. That's exactly why I say if you're gonna look for the day trade tomorrow morning, that's where you have to be cautious, right? Trying to play the gap fill within such a small movement, especially if you open flat. But otherwise, I would prefer to play the move over 315 if we do end up getting that, and we see some broader market momentum start to build. All right. But yeah, like I mentioned, I would look for a move over 128 here on Apple. Above the 128, 133 should end up trading. Of course, we want to see if the market can hold relatively the strength that it did after those FOMC minutes, or do we end up getting a flip case scenario, which I think most of us have seen multiple times, where usually FOMC days we get one type of sentiment in terms of market price action, and the next day it's entirely a 360. So that is plausible that we give back all these gains here today, but I'm just in the camp where if we can hold, I believe there's a lot of momentum that can potentially build. All right. So that's a name that I'll keep an eye on. The other name that I know everyone has their eyes on is Tesla. It's finding nice to see some life out of this thing, but I would be looking to see if we can break over 116 half is what I'm looking at. Over 116 half, then I believe that you could look to potentially even get a swing. Of course, depending how we end up opening up tomorrow. If sentiment continues to stay positive and we get a little bit of a short-term push, then above that 116 half, then we can trade this up towards 124. I have 124.57 is what I'm watching. All right. So we'll see if there's any kind of follow through, particularly with Tesla here, because we know that Tesla's actually been one of showing multiple days of relative weakness. Was today just a fluke, or do we see any kind of follow through on this price action here today? Is that big question mark. All right. Let's see what else that we can take a peep at. Prachi, you mentioned Nike. I feel like I've looked at Nike. It might have been over the weekend though. This is actually a pretty insane uptrend that we've been in for Nike here. I will say that. A nice push that's taking place here. The most glaring resistance that I can see right now is pushing right up towards this 126 mark, which is roughly about another 5 point move from current levels. So I would say that if we end up opening green tomorrow, we see some strength in the Dow here particularly as well tomorrow. We can see this get a continuation up towards that 126 mark. If you're looking for support, your support is sitting at 118 and a quarter is what I'm looking at. So 118.23 specifically is what I'm looking at for support. If we get any kind of pullback, then you look for that support at that 118.23 mark. And you look to buy the dip, and then of course look to take out the high from today, in which case then you'll be looking for your overall target that I mentioned at that 126 mark. All right. Let's see what else. Kyle Roblox. Let's see what's going on with Roblox. Now this is a name that I have not looked at probably in weeks, maybe months, just because I know that it's pretty much just been in the gutter with along with a lot of other growth names. But you have a nice little curling bottom. I will say that is something that actually stands out. If you can get a move over 29.76, I believe that you should be doable to get into some calls here. So over 29.76, then you look to play that gap fill up towards that $32 mark. And I would preferably like to say spreads on a name like this, in which we know that growth has been very stubborn in terms of building any kind of momentum, particularly. So I would be more cautious in trying to play this more to the safe side on pretty much using a spread rather than just using a naked call on this, right? That would pretty much be my aim towards this, playing it up towards the $32 mark. But like I said, if I mean, obviously maybe it's end up being a day trade for you, but if you end up getting that breakout over that 29.76 mark, that the gap fill is basically what you're looking to play. In terms of support, if you're looking for maybe a buy the dip type of opportunity, you look to buy this off of 27.41 is what I'm looking at as for support. All right, so 27.41 is your support. Your breakout is over 29.76, playing it up towards the gap fill. All right. Yeah, that's why I say, I mean, it does have a setup. I mean, the daily is looking like it's presenting a nice little falling wedge action. But the fact is that I don't trust the floor in terms of saying that this is a decent falling wedge to get a bigger move than just trying to play that miniature gap fill that's on that daily chart. That's my concern. If we were to maybe end up seeing this break north over, say, 33, 34, and then we would potentially be flirting with a breakout of this falling wedge type of action. But it is still fairly weak. We could end up filling that gap and come right back down, in which case we can make a new 52-week low. That's basically my concern for that. All right. But I would more so, if it was personally me, I would look for the day trade aspect. If you get a break over 29.76, you look to day trade it into the gap fill, and hopefully it ends up being a one-day wonder for you, particularly. All right. Let's see if there's anything else that I needed to pretty much touch bases on. I did mention that I wanted to take a look at Boeing. This has just been monsters. I mentioned 208 is 208.95 is what I'm looking at for resistance, and that's also a weekly gap, no daily gap fill that we're looking at, which dates back towards February 22nd. So I do like this one in particular. Do I expect this to likely end up gapping up into that resistance? I would not be surprised just because of the fact that it's absolutely vertical now. It would not shock me that we end up missing a day trade opportunity on this tomorrow, and it's likely going to end up gapping up at resistance if we do end up seeing that relative strength continue. All right. But outside of that, I think I kind of covered most of the key names that I wanted to within the tech sector, looking at Boeing and the names that you guys pretty much outlined for me. I'm hoping that we can see a follow through on today's price action. I think that's the biggest thing that we all want to see, rather than having a straight bloody day tomorrow in which we give back all the gains and sentiment ends up flipping. All right. That's pretty much the biggest question mark. And then also what I mentioned was the key levels on SPY. Watching to play the extremes on this little, I want to say, 1 hour wedge that we have, either above 384 into resistance or below 381 towards support, and playing out for those extremes. All right. But other than that, I will wrap up today's session. I appreciate you guys joining as always. Everyone have a good afternoon, and I will see you guys tomorrow. Later.